I'm carrying on in this series that I began last week called Jesus Rocks. And we've been looking at this whole idea, the fact that Jesus does rock. How many remember Michael Jackson got dubbed the King of Pop? You all remember that? And he kind of embraced that. He liked that. But years before that, Elvis Presley got dubbed the King of Rock. And do you know what he said about that? He said, I'm not the king. Jesus is the king. I'm just an entertainer. And he rejected that term. And Jesus is the rock. And we talked about that last week, that he is the rock in which our lives are to be built. The scripture says he is our rock. He is our fortress. There is no other. And he told us that we were to build our house, our life, upon the rock. And so what we've been doing in this little series is we've been looking at how would you do that? What exactly would that look like? And I took the word rock, R-O-C-K, and I've been using those 4 letters for our 4 themes each week. And last week was he restores our relationships. And I started there on purpose because I think it's foundational. If you can't get your relationship right with God, you're never going to have right relationships with other people. And so that's why I drilled that home, took a whole message to do that. And when I have a pretty simplistic view of the world, I think all of our problems are relational. I mean, some are pretty obvious. I mean, the violence and the hatred and the wars and the civil rights and the human slavery that goes on and the abuse, those are relationship problems. People are not loving their brother. But I think it goes way beyond that. Someone asked me the other day, they said, how come the divorce rate is so high? And I said, I'll tell you why, because murder is illegal. That's why it's so high. But I really think it's just another relational problem, right? And people say, well, Pastor Mark, that's ridiculous. If I have a problem with my computer, that's not a relational problem. Yes, it is. That means you don't have a 12-year-old that knows how to reboot your computer or reset your DNS, right? And you say, well, what about a car problem? How's that relational? You don't have a father like my kids do that can fix their cars, right? You say, well, money problems are not relational. They're totally relational. I mean, you probably got fired from your job because nobody liked you, but maybe there's this. Maybe you didn't have an aunt that died and left you $1 million. That's a relationship issue. So Aunt Betsy dies. She's very, very wealthy. The 3 nieces, she has no kids, the 2 nieces and 1 nephew show up at the reading of the will. And they're reading the will, and she writes this. She says, to my niece Janice, I leave her my estate and all the contents of it. To my niece Susan, who always was so kind to me, I leave my investment portfolio and my entire bank account. And to my nephew Chad, who lived just down the street, but only visited me to remind me to mention him in the will. To him I say, hi, Chad. That's good, isn't it? And so that was last week. He restores relationships. This week we're going to look at the O. The O is overcomes all opposition. And so here's where we need to start with this. The scripture tells us 20 times in the New Testament that you are an overcomer. How many of you want to be an overcomer? How many of you would like to be an overcomer? Do you know what the prerequisite to being an overcomer is? Opposition. You remember last week I told you the prerequisite of meaningful relationships was camping, and the prerequisite for overcomer. See, you can't be an overcomer if you don't have something to overcome. But here's the good news. Jesus promised you that you would have opposition, adversity. He said, you will have tribulation in this world. But be of good cheer, for I have what? Overcome the world. He says there will be tribulation. I know one time, I'm sure I was preaching on that. I said, how come nobody has that verse up on their fridge, that you will have tribulation in this world? And a guy sent me a message and a picture of his fridge, and he had that verse up on his fridge. He said, some of us do. I thought, what a weirdo. Who would want that on their fridge? But he understood this, that he said, you will be an overcomer because I have overcome. And if we are children of God, then that by virtue makes us overcomers. But here's what I want to remind you. Clearly, we are not overcomers just because we're born into this world. You were not born an overcomer, just like you weren't born a winner. No offense, but you weren't born a winner. You were born a whiner. Literally, right? You came out of the womb whining. You cried when you were born, and you cried when you were wet, and you cried when you were poopy, and you cried when you were tired, and you cried when you were hungry, you cried when you were cranky, and you cried when you were 34, and your parents kicked you out of the house. And we were just born that way, and we came into this world. If you're going to be an overcomer, this is what the scripture tells us in the book of Revelation. He writes the 7 letters to the 7 churches, and do you know that every single one of those churches, he said to them, to he who overcomes, every single one of them had this promise as to what would happen if they overcame the opposition, the persecution, the tribulation, and the adversity of life. Meaning this, not everybody will overcome. So what our job here today is to try to figure out, what are we going to do? What do we need to do to be able to overcome opposition and adversity in the world? So I've got 3 things. I'm going to throw them up on the screen. The first one is this: attitude is everything. Number 2, action is essential. And number 3, achievement is eventual. Number 1, attitude is everything. I know some of you are thinking, saying, Pastor Mark, haven't you made that point before in other sermons? And the answer to that question would be yes. Do you know why I use it over and over again? Do you know why? Yes, because attitude is everything. That's right. And it's the starting point. And it really, truly is. If we don't get our attitude sorted out, if we can't figure out how we're going to view life, we're never going to get this sorted out. And so I was thinking about this. I thought, I do talk about that quite a bit. I talk to our staff about it. I talk to other pastors about it. I talk to the congregation about it. And I'm always reminding people attitude is everything. And one day I decided, I wonder if there's a book called Attitude is Everything. I wonder if somebody already wrote that book, because I could write that book. Darn it, someone beat me to it. This guy right here, his name is Jeff Keller. He wrote the book called Attitude is Everything. I thought, I'm going to download this book and find out if he and I are on the same page. This guy was a lawyer, made lots of money, was very successful, but he was very unhappy in life. He did a little self-analysis, and he decided what was wrong in his life was his attitude, his perspective on life. And I'm reading through this. I downloaded it. I was reading through it, laughing my head off, thinking, I preach that stuff from a Christian perspective all day long. But there was one little thing that was a little nugget that I kind of liked, that I'm going to share with you from the book, that I thought was interesting. He said, your attitude is your window on life. He says, you actually can't change the world. The world is what it is, and it looks a certain way. And how you see the world is the window or the attitude in which you look out. And if your attitude is clear, you see it in a positive way. But if your attitude has been clouded, if it has become dirty from the muck of life, you look at life with a different perspective, and you look out this cloudy window, and what do you see? And he uses this simple example about 2 people looking out the window, and the one guy says, what a beautiful sunny day. The other one says, it looks like rain to me. And when we think about that, that's true. We all kind of have these perspectives. Where are you on the continuum? Are you the positive attitude guy, or are you the negative attitude guy? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a few minutes. We're going to go to Scripture. We're going to look at a really familiar passage to all of you. And it's the story of the 12 spies being sent by Moses into the Promised Land to spy it out. And it's in Numbers chapter 13. We're going to start verse 27. I'll just read it. You'll remember it all. And we're going to drive home a few points. It says, then they told him and said, we went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Remember, they had grapes so big they had to carry them on poles. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land in the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Hutterites, the Mennonites, they dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea. I add stuff when it suits me, you know that. The Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it. Say, we are well able to overcome. I want that to ring in your soul. But the men who had gone up with them said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report in the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw are men of great stature. There were giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. You all know this story. You all know this passage. Here's what I don't want you to miss. These 12 men, one from each tribe, went into the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey and abundance and all kinds of positive things. They both saw, or rather all 12 of them, both groups, saw exactly the same thing, correct? They were together. They experienced this all together. And yet one brought a good report, one brought a bad report. What is the one single difference between those two groups of people? Attitude. Because why? Attitude, Vin, is everything. Attitude is everything. That's the only thing that's different between these two people, is how one saw it compared to how the other person saw it. And see, here's what we would love to think. Be honest with me. How many of you, when you read this story, you got the 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, that brought back the positive report. You got the other 10 who brought back the negative report. When you imagine yourself in that group as one of those spies, who are you? Are you one of the 2 or are you one of the 10? 2. How many of you, let's just be honest, I'm curious. How many of you would like to think you're one of the 2? You don't even want to like to think you are? Like use some faith and say, yes, I'm going to call you a liar in a minute, but at least stretch out. Here's the problem. Statistically, we're probably with the other group. The negative report was 5-1, 10-2. The chances of us being part of that positive group are very slim. You know, they've done research on pessimistic people. They've done it. They've done tests on these people. And they discovered pessimists all have exactly the same blood type. Did you know that? Yeah, B negative, right? And then they found out if they put them in a dark room, they developed. And then they tried this crazy test. They took a pessimist and a car battery, and they examined the two. And at the end, the conclusion was this: the big difference between a car battery and a pessimist is at least the car battery has a positive side, right? And those are corny jokes, but it's sort of true. Now, I'm going to give you a little really simple test. You're going to hate it. I'm going to tell you anyway. You know, one of the questions that we get asked every single day, probably 50 or 100 times a day, is, hey, Mark, how are you? We get that question literally dozens of times. It's actually not a genuine question. Nobody actually cares how you are. That's not what that means, right? I mean, the last, yeah, but you don't want to hear my life story. You do, okay, you have all the time in the world, Terry, but most people don't. And it's really a quick greeting. Hi, how are you? Good, how are you? And that answer that we give, I want you to just think about what answer you give, because people generally give the same answer over and over again. And most people just go in the middle of the road there, and they say, good, fine, whatever. It's pretty flat. It's not super enthusiastic, I'll just be honest with it. But then there's the outliers on either side. And you know, there's those people, how are you doing? Great, fantastic, wonderful, couldn't be better. If I was doing any better, I'd have to be twins. You know those people. And then you have the other people. And you say, hi, how are you? You actually haven't asked them for their life story, and yet they say, well, I could be better, or I'm just okay, or not the best. And what happens is we're all facing life in the same way. But the problem with that, and I'm not criticizing people who answer that way. What I'm saying is that what it does is it kind of reveals your attitude in life, whether you realize it or not. And you know those people that if you could think of the most positive person you know in your life, wherever that is, the second most positive, I know I'm number one, but if you could think of the second most positive person in your life and you ask them how are they doing, what are they going to say? Great, fantastic, wonderful, super, couldn't be better. That's how they're going to answer. And their positivity has a lot to do with what comes out of their mouth. And so I just want us to think about this. Life, you can't actually change life, but the world that's out there. But you can change your attitude. So some of you heard this story. I told it a couple of weeks ago, but most of you haven't. So I was over at my mother's apartment, and I was walking down the hall, and there was this cleaning lady, and she couldn't, I mean, no kidding, she was under 5 feet tall. She was like this big, and she was coming down the hall, and she had one of those carts with all the chemicals and rags and stuff on it, and she was coming down the aisle like this, dancing, and she was singing. And then she couldn't see me because she was so short and the cart was so high. And she came down the aisle dancing like this and singing. And then she went and she did a spin like this and grabbed the cart and ran right into me. And I started laughing and I said, wow, somebody's in a good mood today. To which she answered and she said, well, when you have joy in your heart, you can't but help to dance. And I said to her, so are you a Muslim or a Hindu or what's going on? I was kidding with her. She says, no, I'm a Christian. And I said, I could tell a mile away. And no offense to Hindus and Muslims, but only Christians do stuff like that. They're the ones who dance down the aisles and they sing and they do these things. And here's my point to you. If you have Jesus in your heart, you should be so full of the joy that it should begin to exude in everything you do and everything you are, and you should be dancing down the aisles. Do you know what I did? I'm the kind of guy that does this. I said, I'll dance with you, and the two of us started dancing in the hall. Don't tell my wife I was dancing with the cleaning lady. And I was thinking about it, and this is no judgment on her, but she spends her whole life cleaning up other people's dirt and trash, and yet she's full of joy. And I think, isn't that the way you want to go through life? Don't you want to look past the mundane of life and begin to enjoy it? So my son said something to me a few months ago, kind of cracked me up. I know he didn't intend this to be a compliment, by the way, but I take everything as a compliment. So it doesn't really matter what you say to me. I'm going to think, well, that was nice of you. And so he was talking about the fact that for 2 years I did those video updates. And for 2 years during COVID, I was updating whether we were open or whether we were closed or how darkly closed or how absolutely locked down we were or whatever. And he said to me, Pop, you're the only guy I've ever seen that does a weekly video and you give people bad news with this huge smile on your face. What is wrong with you? I said, there's nothing wrong with me. There's enough pessimism in the world. They've heard all the bad news. I'm going to at least give them the bad news with a smile on my face. Because when you have Jesus in your life, there should be joy, joy, joy deep in your heart. Is there a song about that? No. Might be, no? So here's what I want to do. I want to take a few minutes. I'm really driving home this one point. If we get to the other ones, great. But I have some sub-points for my first point. And the big question would be this. Okay, maybe I don't have a great attitude. How do I adjust my attitude? Here they are. How do I adjust my attitude? Change what you think about, change how you see yourself, change who you hang out with. So let's talk about this. The first thing is you've got to change what you think about. And you see, Joshua and Caleb, what were they thinking about? Joshua and Caleb, when they went in and they came back, what were they thinking about? Victory. They were thinking about victory. They're thinking about a land flowing with milk and honey. What were the other guys thinking about? They were thinking about the giants. Did you notice that? They were fixated on the problem. They're fortified cities. It's full of giants. They're stronger than us. And those other two optimistic, sanguine goofballs couldn't care less about that because they were thinking about the positive things. You know what Henry Ford once said? He said, if you think you can or you think you can't, you are right. Did you get that? Yep. You get that? You are what you think. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. You say, but Pastor Mark, you can't control what you think about. Really? Seriously? You didn't say that, but people do say this. Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, going to throw it up on the screen. It says, finally, brethren, this is Paul in Philippians chapter 4. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are a good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate, think on these things. Can you change what you think about? You absolutely can. It's within your control. Excuse me. In your control to decide what you're going to think about. Second thing is this. Change how you see yourself. What did these guys say? They said there's giants in the land and we are as grasshoppers in our own sight and also in their sight. Did anyone call them grasshoppers? Did the giants stand there, go fee, fi, fo, fum? You guys look like grasshoppers. Did anyone call them grasshoppers? Nobody called them grasshoppers. They were grasshoppers in their own sight. And here's what the big problem is. We have people going through life looking at deciding who they think they are, not based on any fact. We have Gideon, we've looked at him many times. He says, I'm the least in my father's house, and my clan is the weakest in all Manasseh. He had this inferiority thing that he embodied. Nobody told him he was the least. Nobody told him he was the weakest. He decided that's who he was. And the problem is we can't go through life looking at ourselves in these kind of ways. And you know, one of the things I see when I look at our culture, we have all kinds of people that have decided they're going to identify as victims. We have whole groups of people, whole great swaths of our culture that have decided that somehow their life isn't what it should be because they have been somehow victimized by somebody else or something in their past or some injustice somewhere. And every time you turn on the television, I can barely stand watching the news because somebody is always whining about somebody. And you know what? It's never their fault. It's always somebody else's fault because they are a victim. That's a victim mentality. That's a grasshopper mentality. And I'm telling you, they can complain till the cows come home. They're never going to move forward in life. So I'm going to show you a picture. They were telling this story about this woman. She lived in an apartment. I think it was a government-assisted apartment in Ontario somewhere. And she was on the CBC News, and she was complaining about how her apartment had mold in it, and it was inadequate housing because it had mold in it. And I want to show you the exact picture they showed, the exact picture with this woman. I'm not going to show you the woman. Here was the picture. That's her kitchen. And you see the window? You see that little corner of mold in the corner under the window? She pointed to that and said, see, there's mold in my kitchen. Look at the rest of the kitchen. And this is what people do. They look at that little corner that's somebody else's fault, and they miss the fact that she's living like an absolute pig in squalor. Whose fault is that? Right? I think I have a hard time feeling sorry for her. There's these things called cleansers and rags and washcloths. You can wipe that stuff off your fridge. And there was a guy by the name of Charles Sykes. He wrote this book called A Nation. He was a journalist, still alive. He wrote this book called A Nation of Victims. And I'm going to save you the trouble. You don't need to go read the book. It's just one horrible story about how someone thinks they're a victim after another. Actually, there's so many of them that they're almost comical. You'd think it was a joke, the whole book. I'll give you one story that he tells. So there's this FBI agent. He had a gambling problem. He embezzled $2,000. You know how they can steal stuff from evidence room or however he got it. He stole $2,000, gambled it all away. He got caught. The FBI fired him. He was an FBI agent. Seems sort of legitimate. He actually took them to court, took the FBI to court, and he said this, that his gambling addiction was a disability. Because it was an addiction, therefore it was a disability, so therefore he was fired because of his disabilities, and the FBI was required to rehire him and reinstate him as an agent. I thought, seriously, is that a made-up story? It seems like it's a made-up story. What judge would rule that way? But that's the world we now live in. Everybody's a victim. There's nothing that is your fault anymore. Right? You just somehow got victimized. So we have to start changing the way we look at ourselves. And then the third thing in this thing is you've got to change the people you hang out with. So here, again, I'm going to ask you this question. So you got Joshua and Caleb. You got these other 10 spies, these really super negative guys. Who are you going to hang out with? Who do you want to party with? You know, the answer would be, how many of you want to hang out with Joshua and Caleb? Just be honest. Yeah, you want to. You'd like to think you would. Who did everybody hang out with? The other 10 losers. They chose the 10, and they didn't go in. They wandered and died in the wilderness for 40 years. This is ridiculous. And we look at this, and people have figured this out, you know, that when you hang around with negative people, they drag you down. They did this study, and they asked this, it was a simple question. They said, if you had to go to work and you could either work shorthanded or work with somebody side by side with a bad attitude, which would you rather do? 100% of them said, we would rather work shorthanded. You know, people understand this. These kind of people drag you down. They call them emotional vampires in the workplace. And you know, here's what the stats on it. You know, we hire people because of their aptitude, but that's not why they get fired. They get fired because of their attitude. It's true. 89% of people who lost their jobs, it had nothing to do with their performance, had everything to do with their ability or inability to get along with other people. It was their attitude. And so what we want to do is we want to hang out with the people that are going to bring us up, not people who are going to drag us down. So so there's some things we can do. You can change it, what you think about. You can change how you see yourself, and you can change who you hang out with. So I want to tell you a really cool story to just inspire you before I get off this point. And it's about this guy here. This guy here is Nick Vujicic. And it's easy for you to say, right? And but anyway, how many of you have ever seen this guy? You go on YouTube, watch one of his speeches. He's absolutely inspiring. This guy was born with no arms, no legs, no explanation why he has no arms or no legs. He grew up in this environment where he thought, I can't do anything, I can't play soccer, I can't do this, I can't do that. He felt sorry for himself because of the way he was. And then one day, he came to this realization. Now, he's a believer. Obviously, you'll find this from this story. He came to the realization that this was something about him he couldn't change. He couldn't change who he was. This was the way he was born. This was the way God made him or whatever. It's the way he came into this world. Nothing he could do about it. The only thing he could change was his attitude. Thank you. You're getting it. Attitude is everything. He reinvented his life. He goes and he speaks to young people in particular, but people of all sorts. And he says, look, you can't change the things you can't change, but what you can change is what's inside and how you see yourself and who you are. All those things I've been talking about tonight. And he says, you can be whoever you want to be. And you are not limited by anything because attitude is everything. So I think we have a picture of him speaking to a crowd. Do we have a picture there? It usually goes up on a stand or a table like, look at that crowd he's speaking to. He's speaking to thousands and thousands of people. And I love this. He says, I always keep a pair of shoes in my closet. And people say, why? He says, because I believe in miracles. But he says, in the meantime, he's taking up these sports. Look at this. Look what he does. Here he is golfing. He golfs. Here he is skydiving. He got a little help on that one. Here he is surfing. Here he is swimming. I don't know about you, but that picture looks like he's swimming like a rock to me. He doesn't look like he's doing that great. And people said, how can you swim? And this is what he said. He said, I have no arms and legs to hold me down, to drag me down. And I think, man, if this guy can live a life like this, if this guy can live a life with enthusiasm and energy and excitement, why can't the rest of us do it? So number one, attitude is everything. Right? You got that one? Second thing, action is essential. Okay, attitude is one thing. Now you're going to have to act on that. And the problem was with the children of Israel, they would not act on Joshua and Caleb's advice. And because they didn't act, they didn't receive the inheritance. Now, eventually, Joshua and Caleb did. We'll talk about that in a few minutes as I wrap this thing up. But when we look at what Jesus did, Jesus always expected people to act. It was essential. It was part of faith. I've told you this hundreds of times, that faith acts. We look at the paraplegic, for example, the paralytic that was lying on the bed. What did Jesus say to him? Take up your bed and walk. That was an action. He said to the man with the withered hand, step forward and reach out your hand. He had to act. He acted and he was healed. We think Peter walking on the water. He says, if that's you, Lord, bid me to come. He said, come and walk on the water. Peter acted and he walked on water. Only man in history that we know that did that. Even when he raised Lazarus from the dead, it cracks me up. I've told you this before. He says, Lazarus, come forth. Lazarus was dead and he still had to act. And most of you, you're not even dead. And so we have way more potential to act than he did. And here's how it works, people. If you don't act, Stephen Covey said this in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He said, you have to act or be acted upon. And that's what happens when we're dealing with opposition. If you don't act in the face of adversity, if you don't act, you're going to get acted upon. You're going to have to do something about this. So I want to tell you a little story about this that I think you'll find amusing. When I was about 11 years old, I told you last week my parents never took us camping. That was true. But they sent me camping as punishment. And when I was turned 11 years old, they started sending me out to Camp Stevens on Lake of the Woods, and I didn't know what to expect. And I ended up in a cabin with 12-year-old Louis. And so there I was, 11-year-old, he was 12-year-old Louis. Louis's parents, they were from New Jersey, they sent him every single year for 7 weeks to Camp Stevens. And I remember thinking, boy, his parents must love him. And then in my adulthood, I realized his parents really didn't like him. They were always trying to get rid of Louis. But Louis was a veteran, and I got to be in his cabin, and he knew everything, and he knew everybody, and he knew all the ropes, and I just kind of followed him around. And you imagine, we went on our very first ever 3-day wilderness canoe trip. And we all packed up, and away we went. And can you imagine my good fortune? I got in Louis' canoe. Now, of course, where's the rookie go, in the front or the back, the bow or the stern? Anybody know? Yeah, the rookie goes in the bow, so I was in the bow. Louis was in the stern. And so our first few days were magical, and Louis was back there full of confidence and leading us through the still calm waters. And it was sunny and beautiful. It was fantastic. Day 3, a storm came up. And we had to traverse this very long channel directly into a north wind that was just coming with huge waves banging away at us. And I was paddling with all my might, and we were getting further and further behind. And we knew the camp counselor told us we just needed to get around that corner. And once we got around that corner, which was about a mile, once we got around that corner, we would be in calmer water. So we had a goal in mind. And so what happened, though, is we just got further and further behind. The other canoes were not going to wait for us. They were going to get around that corner and wait for us once they got around that corner. And so we started going. We were dropping further and further behind. And then finally, Louis says, let's go closer to the shore. We're in the middle. He says, let's go closer to the shore. I thought, well, I don't know why. It's just as rough there close to shore, and it's all rocky. I don't know why we would go there. But anyway, and we were getting slower and slower. Something was not going good at the back. I don't know what it was. I was just paddling with all my might. And so we went closer and closer to shore. We were about 20 feet from shore. And all of a sudden, Louis stood up, leapt out of the canoe, and started swimming for shore. And I'm in the front of the canoe like this, trying to control this thing in this huge storm. I yelled at him, I said, Louis, what are you doing? He said, we're going to die. I'm running for my life. And I thought, what is he doing? And so I managed to get the paddle of the canoe over to where he was, and I grabbed him by his life jacket, and I said, you get back into this canoe. And you're in the bow. And I said, you get in I'm going to get us through this. And I went and sat in the stern, and I started paddling. I thought, you act or you're acted upon. And we were being acted upon by opposition. And we had a decision to make in that moment, or at least I did. And that was what I was going to lead, and I was going to act. And we caught up to the rest of those people. I realized my respect for Louis went down quite significantly. And it was from that moment in my life that I realized that I had inherent leadership. And I've been bossing people around ever since. And it's been working beautifully for me. So the first thing is attitude is everything. The second thing is action is essential. Whatever you're in, whatever situation you were in, you have to act. You can't just sit there. Passivity is a recipe for failure and defeat. And the last and final feeling is this, is that achievement is eventual. And see, here's the thing we get wrong. We often think that if we're going to overcome opposition in life, it needs to happen right away, because we're the McDonald's generation, right? You go to McDonald's to eat because it's fast. You heat your food up in the microwave because it's fast. We want everything fast, and we want instant results, and we want instant success. And the point is, you're not going to get instant success. When you are in the face of opposition, it may take some time, and you're going to have to fight through it. Like the father who says to his son, would you like an ice cream sundae? He says, no, I want it today. You all got that, right? And so we have to decide, are we going to be in this for the long haul or not? Terry comes just to boo me. It's really interesting, isn't it? You can't get me down, man, because I know who I am in Christ. Attitude is everything. Okay, I got the mic, Terry. We're carrying on here. We're carrying on here. So we look at what the scripture says. He says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials or temptations, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience or perseverance. Boy, you got a different translation. And let patience have its perfect work, and you will be complete in this life, lacking nothing. He didn't say it was going to come instantly. He said you're going to have to fight for it, you're going to have to work for it, you're going to have to strive for it. So we look at these champions of the faith in Scripture that overcame their adversity. David was 7 years before he became king. Joseph was 13 years before the dream was fulfilled of his brothers and family bowing down to him. Abraham was 25 years before he actually saw the child born that he was promised. Joshua and Caleb, how many years till they finally got into that promised land? I'll tell you how many years it was. It was 45 years. 45 years, 40 in the wilderness, 5 years of battling and fighting off the opposition. And then do you remember that passage? We have Caleb, and he says, here I stand this day, 85 years old, and I am as strong this day as I was when Moses sent me 45 years ago. Now, therefore, give me this mountain. The mountain that he had seen 45 years earlier, he was claiming it in that moment. Achievement is eventual. It will never happen overnight. You know that Winston Churchill was still winning elections at 80 years old? Do you know that Benjamin Franklin penned the Declaration of Independence at 81 years old? Do you know Mother Teresa was 84 years old and she was still working amongst the poorest of poor in India? Do you know that John Wesley was still preaching 2 times a day, 7 days a week when he was 86 years old? Do you know that George Bernard Shaw wrote his last play when he was 91 years old? You know, people, you ain't done yet. Some of you haven't even started yet. And here's the thing to remember. Attitude is everything. Action is essential. And achievement is inevitable. Let's stand together, shall we?